Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's live briefing. Today, we are going to be talking about face masks and whether they're a good idea, particularly pertinent in light of last night's government announcement. We have the usual cast of stars from the Independent Sage, and I'm going to first be passing over to Professor Robert West and then Professor Susan Mickey, who are the lead authors of the consultation paper. Professor West, if I could come to you first.
Sure, thanks very much, and welcome everybody. So obviously this is a very contentious issue, and I have to say that it's not just contentious, within public and political circles. There's also quite a lot of disagreement in scientific circles, which is why I think a lot of the messaging has been quite confused, or appears quite confused so far. And what I'm going to do just in 5 minutes is to just briefly take us through the journey so far to where we're at, and then Susan will take over and look at some of the really important issues that need to be resolved as we go forward. So obviously, as you will all know, the practice of wearing face masks in public it varies enormously from country to country across the globe, and has been very rare, obviously, in the UK. But in the face of the pandemic, it has increased. Now, although there's obviously a very strong prima facie case that face masks are going to reduce the risk of transmission of a respiratory virus, that's clear. There's no doubt about that. The scientific issues and the issues with regard to evidence are the extent to which the benefits that you may get from this outweigh potential harms, because it's not necessarily without cost or harm. And that's where the science really has been, until very recently, at least in my view, in the view of many of us, quite equivocal. Which is when the science is equivocal, some people would say, well, you've got to go on common sense. Well, unfortunately, common sense isn't a good substitute for science in that case, because it could take you in very dangerous directions. So in the report, we look at the various different sorts of evidence and try and summarize them as quickly as possible. But essentially, where we are with the evidence has been that the randomized controlled trials have been pretty well exactly equivocal, which means that we don't know whether they're a benefit or not. It's not that they're not, it's just that we don't know from those studies. The observational studies, the comparative observational studies, have suggested that there's a benefit, but they've been potentially subject to quite a lot of confounding. That means to say the parent association might not be causal. It might be due to some other factors that people can easily identify. So what's happened in the more recent weeks, actually, is that new evidence has come in, and that's what happens in science. And that certainly led me to shift my view a bit, which for many of us has taken the balance of evidence to some degree in favor of there being a net benefit. The two studies which are mentioned in the report, one is a study in Germany which looked at what happened when there was a particular town that introduced mandating face masks, and they used other towns that were similar as a control, and they did appear to show a substantial benefit from that. The other study was on a US Navy carrier, which looked at the differences between people who were wearing them and people who weren't. And that's quite an interesting study because it kind of simulates what you see in a lot of enclosed spaces, which is the sort of spaces that we're looking at to see whether face masks might have a benefit. And what was particularly for me interesting about that study is it did appear to show a benefit for the wearer. And that's something that I think we've up until recently thought, well, probably not much benefit for the wearer. It's probably to protect other people's. But I have to say the evidence is still, in the normal course of events, a lot of us would feel that this wouldn't be enough to legislate to make people do something. But these are unusual times, and so what many of us feel is that the balance of evidence has shifted sufficiently to for some form of mandating. But of course, there are issues. And of course, the WHO has very recently changed its guidance on this now, and that's something we have to take very seriously. And organizations like the Royal Society and the and other organisations have changed their view on this. So it's obviously a moving area. But my view is that where we are now is much more along the lines of not, is this a good thing or is it not a good thing, but how can we maximise the benefit as it is, such as it is, from wearing a face mask while minimizing the potential harms. And the harms potentially are there, not least, obviously people talk about false reassurance and so on, and people talk about masks acting as contaminants in themselves. But another potentially major harm is that we take our eye off the ball with other measures that are really, really important to protect the population. So with that, I will hand over to Susan, who will go a little bit more into some of these issues that need to be considered.
Thank you. So I want to raise 5 areas where we would like discussion and we would value input. So far, the governments in Scotland and England now and other nations have identified public transport and shops as the high-risk places where there's indoor enclosed spaces, often with little ventilation, and with people who are working there for long hours, and therefore exposed to many different people, and so at high risk of transmission. So one question is, should this be extended to other settings beyond shops and public transport? The question of universities has been raised, and I think different universities are thinking about different things. I've had emails asking about that. It's a complex issue. It may be that the best thing is to identify the types of indoor space for which mask or face covering would be especially important. And actually we use the word face covering because we don't want to confuse with surgical masks where you're maybe using them when other people in healthcare and social care settings have more need of them, and also to avoid a lot of plastic waste with single-use masks. Another is sports facilities. This is where, again, it's very high risk because people are exhaling deeply, and this will emit potentially contaminated droplets. There are issues there. There are places of worship where large groups may be getting together. And also the issue of schools has been raised with a further complexity about younger people. So these are all areas that we've identified as needing more consideration. The second issue is the type of face covering. The WHO guidance recommends 3 layers of different types of material in order to filter out the maximum number of droplets. And one of the issues is that, again, more recent evidence is really pointing to aerosols as a potential transmission route. Aerosols are droplets that are really, really tiny, so they don't fall to the floor in the way that droplets that are exhaled from somebody's mouth would do. They hang about in the air, potentially for hours. And it's going to be really important to try and identify what types of mask can try and filter out most of that kind of aerosol in terms of the wearer. Obviously, once it's in the air, everybody is prone to it. And so that's an area where we really need to get more expertise, because the idea of we'll just rip up an old t-shirt and make a mask, which could be on a very thin bit of cotton. There's a real concern there that people will be given false reassurance by those kinds of face coverings, which are not stopping quite a lot of the droplets. The third very important issue is equity. The importance of giving messages out in a variety of key languages so that everybody has access to the public information campaign that's needed. And also that it's not just done through social media and the web, but it comes through television, comes through posters, comes through leaflets. Another issue is financial hardship. Unfortunately, this pandemic has made inequalities even more severe, and we have now millions of people who are facing considerable financial hardship. And even if each of these face coverings or masks cost a few pounds each, if you're needing to wash them and reuse them, once we'll get at least 2 each, if you have a large household, this is a significant amount of money. Other countries give these out free. And I do think in terms of equity, we do need to ensure that everybody who needs them and can't afford them is providing them without cost, because otherwise it's unequal and it's unreasonable, and people may not be able to afford them. Then there's the issue of exemptions. There's many reasons why it may be unsuitable for people to wear face coverings. They may have respiratory problems, certain kinds of mental health and disability problems, and it's really important that people are accepted for not wearing face coverings in these different conditions. And I think the Scotland model, where it's based on people self-declaring that there are reasons why they're not wearing a face covering, is the road we should go down with this. There's also the issue of people who are hard of hearing, who depend on lip reading. And so in order to understand what people are saying, we'd have to ask them to remove their face covering. Now, these are areas which requires specialist expertise, and we would very much value the input of organisations and individuals with those expertise about how this, and I'm sure there are a range of other issues that I haven't touched on, should be dealt with. And finally, this country, unlike other countries, doesn't have a culture and a universal habit of wearing face coverings. And so we really need to think about what kind of lever. And history shows that jumping in with legislation, whilst it communicates importance, is not always the best way. We really need a very effective public information campaign. Those of you who are old enough might remember the seatbelt campaign, where there was a huge resistance to wearing seatbelts, but there was a very effective public information and persuasion campaign followed by legislation. And that habit was adopted universally really quite quickly. So as ever, we need clear, consistent, coherent messaging explaining why this is needed, and also how. For face coverings to be effective, they need to be the right kind of face covering. They need to be closely fitting, because studies have shown if they're not, there's about 50% leakage. Really important to explain why people, if they have to take them off, should fold them up and put them into a sealed bag or pocket, but not be putting them around their forehead, chin, neck, where if they are infected, they can spread the virus that they can then touch their face covering and then touch other surfaces that people touch. Transmission may be increased that way. So how people are wearing them, really important, and not to be putting them down, for example, on surfaces. Then we've got the issue of using social norms as to why we're doing, why we're asking people to do this. It's out of respect and out of care for other people around them in their community. And the more that this is adopted as a practice, the more there'll be an expectation and the more that it will be taken on. So I think our view is very much this should be light touch and really avoid heavy-handed fines, etc. And when I say light touch, again, I will refer to the what Scotland has done, which I think has got it exactly right and seems to be being very effective. Use of role models for any sort of set of behaviours where we're not sure that there will be high adherence. Really important to look and see who is not adhering and tailor and target messaging to those people. So we know that it was primarily young people and especially young men who weren't adhering to other restrictions. So important to use the kind of role models that those groups would identify with and look up to. They may be famous personalities in sport or film or music. And finally, the issue about legislation. The light touch issue is really important, because what we don't want to happen is for this practice to sow any divisions or conflict between those who are very ready and happy to wear them and those who are taking longer to persuade. So an enabling and persuading rather than punishing approach, I think, is what we'd be advocating. So we're very much looking forward to hearing your questions, but also your comments and your advice, so that we can feed it in to this interim consultation report and come up hopefully within about a week with a final report. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mickey and Professor West, for framing today's consultation. And as Professor Mickey says, that is exactly what today is about. It's a consultation. And I know the whole group of experts that we have are really eager to hear from you. So before I pass on to our members of the public, and we've got lots who want to ask questions, can I ask that you keep your question as concise as possible so that we can get to as many of you as we possibly can. With that in mind, let's pass over to our first member of the public, who is Parmjeet Flora. Parmjeet, are you with us? I think you're joining us from Winslow.
Yes, can you hear me?
We can.
Oh, fabulous. Thank you very much. And my question relates to some of the releasing of restrictions that we've seen recently, specifically Boris's recent comments about trying to advise work from home members to now return to the office. I myself am an insulin-dependent diabetic, South Asian origin, and so have a number of risk factors. And in relation to what a workplace should do, I'd really like some advice in that respect. Should I be considering going back to work and following the fairly heavy nudge that we've received from Boris, or actually is work with or without face masks still unsafe? Similarly, for other groups within my family, so my grandparents are in their 80s, the releasing of restrictions has meant that there are family functions that they can now attend, and we have no advice as to whether mask wearing for things like engagement parties or small wedding parties that are family parties is the right thing to do. My grandparents, one of them is type 2 diabetic, so again, as well as being in their 80s, also has another risk. So the question really is, as a type 1 diabetic South Asian, what should my company be doing to protect me? And is it safe for me to go back to work? And secondly, for my mama and papaji, who are my grandparents, should they be considering asking the family to also wear face masks when they go to these functions?
Great question, Parmjeet. Now, I'm looking for a hand, but perhaps I could come to Professor Scalia first, if you wouldn't mind, perhaps on the first part of that question.
Yes, I think it's a really interesting question. First of all, I don't think people should be being forced to go back to work simply because it's good for the economy for them to be buying things on the high street or whatever, because for two reasons, really. Because we know travel is a particular source of cross-infection, and avoiding having large numbers of people on buses and tubes and trains is a good thing. So I think it's quite clear to me anyway that the best thing would be if the employer doesn't need the person to come in to work and the person doesn't need to go into work, they should agree to continue with home working for as long as that is satisfactory. And ignore any pressure to do otherwise. It has to be a decision between the employee and the employer. And the second thing is, of course, about the safety of the work environment. And that will vary dramatically, but we do know that it's an issue that we have to be very careful about. On one end of the spectrum, there are the meat plants, which have been a big source of infection, of outbreaks of infection in a variety of countries. But also there have been outbreaks and flare-ups associated with office buildings, and that's very clear as well. So for each separate workplace, there really should be an assessment made by the employer as to what is safe. It's their duty and their responsibility to make things safe for their employees before requiring them to come into work. I'll hand over to my colleagues to deal with the face masks issue, if that's all right.
Thank you.
I wonder if I could, I'm not seeing a hand, but maybe I could turn to Sir David, who is perhaps the nearest in age to Parmjit's parents, who are in their 80s. Sir David, what do you think? What should her parents be doing, and how should they be acting in terms of face masks and going out and the likes?
Thank you, and thank you for the question. What I want to say to you is exactly what I'm doing and what I'm doing with my family, which is that we meet in the garden, no more than 5 people in the garden, and we don't wear face masks, but we do keep 2 meters apart. I've been very, very careful. I'm asthmatic, and that is a precondition. And so I think the whole family is a bit nervous about me meeting up with a range of other people. And that's exactly the right approach. I think we all know that wearing face masks is only one precaution. We need to make sure that we're washing hands frequently and so on. The main point is, if you go to a wedding, for example, outdoors, please. It should be outdoors. It's really wrong to go indoors because you're wearing a face mask, but how do you take a sip at that glass of champagne when you're wearing a face mask? So I wouldn't advise anyone to go into a pub indoors. Outdoors, okay. But also remember the 2 meter rule, the washing hands, all of that is essential. Wearing a face mask is critical when you're going indoors. We all have to do a bit of shopping. So you go into a shop, I always wear a face mask. And I'm always a bit irritated when everyone else isn't wearing a face mask, frankly. So I'm happy to put a bit of social pressure onto others to wear face masks.
Thank you, Sir David. I hope that's answered your question, Parmjit. Brilliant. I'd like to now move on to Benjamin Cypher. Benjamin, are you there? I think a human rights lawyer, Benjamin.
Yes, hello. I work as a barrister mainly in extradition and public law, and I generally appear in 3 sorts of courts: the Magistrates' Court, the Upper Tribunal, and the High Court. And currently, since March, the Upper Tribunal and the High Court have been sitting remotely, with the obvious exception of Johnny Depp's case. But the Magistrates' Court, partly because of the sheer number of cases, is now sitting in person and encouraging everyone to come to court. At Westminster Magistrates' Court, which is the only extradition court in England and Wales, when high-profile people appear, such as Julian Assange, you often get large members of the public trying to come in. So there is a real risk, I would say, of transmission, and social distancing is almost impossible to maintain. And at this particular court, you have a mixture of people. You have police officers, lawyers, paralegals, judges, interpreters, jailers, prisoners, all mixing. You also have long queues. When you arrive at court, you are searched by someone who touches all your belongings. When you go into court to see your client, you sit in a confined space in the cell. The Magistrates' Court has a confined dock. Documents are being passed over. I was concerned about this, and I contacted Professor Trish Greenhalgh, who agreed with me that masks should be mandated in courts. I actually also have contacted a very senior judge who told me that she had difficulty in hearing people when they're in front of her, when they're wearing masks. And lastly, I understand that in Pittsburgh, they have been mandated. There is a perspective, from the perspective of a freelance lawyer, and there is a concern that people will be not able to work if they're being told to go into this environment without mitigations. So my question to you is, do you think that now shops are mandating face coverings? Should they also be mandated in court buildings?
So I could turn to Professor West on this one first.
Yeah, I think that this is one example of potentially high-risk situation. We now have a much better idea of the kind of environments which are going to be high risk, and they're ones that you can imagine now, obviously, where there's crowds of people, whether it's indoors, and when there may be poor ventilation. And we have to recognize, what we have to do is to do a risk assessment of all of these kinds of situations, and then apply rules and principles to those situations. My own view is, with regard to face masks, is that they should be worn, and they should be, everyone should be wearing face masks in those situations. However, to be quite honest, I don't think that will be enough in those situations. I think that we need to look at other measures as well, and that will include, as I think you were alluding to, people touching things and so on. There's a lot of potential contact. We don't know yet with this virus what proportion of the transmission is through these fomite routes, through the contacts, and how much is through the airborne routes. And so we need to take all possible precautions. That means that we must ensure that everyone, in my opinion, everyone should be carrying a hand sanitizer and using it on, every time they touch something. And the key here is touching something, and then ultimately how that gets into is touching your face. And so, if you have a rule which is you never touch your face in a situation unless you know that your hand has been sanitized, that will pretty much eliminate at least that route. It won't eliminate the others. But the other side of it, I think, is to recognize that these can create super spreading events. And therefore, in situations like that, as the government has suggested with bars and restaurants, people need to know exactly who's there, so that if there is a virus outbreak that results from that, it can be stamped out quite quickly. But I think you raise an example of a number of different events of that sort, where we need to take the whole thing in the round. Face masks are going to be one factor, but they're going to be only one factor in a bigger risk management scenario.
Thank you, Professor West. I'd like to turn to Dr. Hack, please.
Thank you, Benjamin, and thank you, Robert. I want to just echo everything that Robert had said, and also what Susan has said about how face masks can't be seen as a standalone measure to protect oneself and to minimize the risk of spreading coronavirus. It's quite extraordinary, really. I mean, until 2 days ago, this government had still very mixed messages about face masks, and I think we need to remember what that means. That sends very mixed messages to the public as well about face masks. And you raise a very important issue, Benjamin, which is, at the moment we're talking about face masks just in supermarkets, for instance, but what about all the other areas? Because as well as courts, as you say, that's a very important area to think about. You've also got the issue of what about high-risk occupations? So for instance, cab drivers, chauffeurs, and others are in extremely high-risk occupations. We know that approximately 60% of the deaths among cab drivers are Black and ethnic minority groups. We know Black and ethnic minority groups are vulnerable. So the government are rushing this through after very mixed messages. And now they haven't said enough about what other areas we should be wearing face masks. If face masks are mandatory, then we should be thinking about all the other areas and occupations we should be protecting as well.
Thank you, Dr. Hack. Benjamin, I hope that's gone some way to answering your question.
Yes, it does. There's just one thing. Just trying to understand that if people are not mandated to wear masks, they just simply don't. And that's been my experience from conversations with other lawyers. They just don't want to do it. That's all I'll say.
Can I say something? I think that's a really, really important point, because it puts a lot of pressure on the people who are trying to, in those situations, who may be trying to marshal that kind of behaviour. It reminds me of the smoke-free legislation, where, at St George's Hospital, where I used to work, it was policy that there was no smoking, but indoors. But it wasn't, because it wasn't mandated, smoking was happening all over the place. And so I think the government does need to look very carefully and quickly at risky situations and about doing risk-benefit assessments. But I also think it's not necessarily always down to the government. I think the court system itself, it is open to institutions themselves to make rules and to communicate policies around this. And so I think there's something that the profession could do that.
I can see suddenly lots of hands. We have also got more questions. So can I ask for a brief comment from Professor Riker and then Professor Mickey?
I think one of the points that Independent Sage has made throughout is it's really important not just to have a series of ad hoc measures, but an overall strategy. and to look at how these different measures work together. So we've articulated very clearly in our documents a towards zero COVID strategy, which means driving down the infections as far as possible. And therefore, it's important to look at how the different measures work together. Now, if face masks are introduced politically as a means of downplaying other measures, then it will be entirely counterproductive. It's not an either or, it's an and. If we add together distancing and hygiene and a good track and trace system and masks, then we can, as in Scotland, move towards zero COVID, and therefore we will then be in a position to reopen fully in due course without masks. So actually we can interact properly. So I think it's really important to understand that masks are part of an overall strategy, and they must be used additively, and they must never be used either by politicians or as by individuals, which is why the messaging which Susan talked about is so absolutely crucial. They must never be used in order to undermine the other measures which are equally critical.
Professor Mickey?
Yeah, to add, this is an important discussion because it's not only your workplace, but these points really apply to all workplaces. If the government haven't included certain workplaces in this particular piece of legislation, there are other pieces of legislation to do with healthy and safe workplaces for people. And it shouldn't be just down to individuals. Individuals are part of professional organisations, trade unions. There's a health and safety executive, health and safety officers that can be brought in. So I would say in all these situations, if anybody's got any concerns about there being high risk of transmitting this virus, then I think you should contact organisations who can come and deal with this at an organisational level, rather than feeling individuals have to, try and deal with it on their own. But obviously, individuals have to try and get that process going.
Thank you, Professor Mickey, and thank you for the question, Benjamin. I'd like to now move on. My colleague Kitty has been keeping an eagle eye on the questions coming in via Twitter. Kitty, what do you have for us?
Thanks, Zach. We've got a few questions pertaining to really just quite basically how you use face masks, because there seems to be the information on how to wear them most effectively seems to be quite lacking. So we've got, can disposable face masks be set aside and reused? How can people obtain affordable masks and also know which kind of masks are the most effective ones? Then separately, we have, should you wash after each use? What is the contamination risk of sharing masks? Yeah, so I think there's some quite good questions that if you could clear up, would be great.
Thank you, Kitty. I'm going to pass this on to Professor Mickey first.
Excellent questions, and these are questions that everybody's going to be asking. And if legislation is going to come in to make these mandatory, then the government does need to give the best possible advice about what kind of mask, how to get it. As I say, they should also be free for those who can't afford to buy them, and should also have very clear instructions. And I think whenever they're sold, there should be clear instructions, but there should be part of a public information campaign to address all these questions about how you put them on and wear them, what you do if you are going to take them off, how long each kind of mask can be worn for, the issues you raise about how to wash them, what temperature to wash them, because what we don't want is to adopt a huge widespread population behaviour that is actually going to cause additional problems if these aren't worn properly. So I don't think it's really best use of our time now, nor do we have all the expertise in terms of, for example, materials and virology to address the question in detail now. But I think the general point is, and what we would say to government, is that the public information campaign needs to start now, and it needs to not only explain why this practice is being recommended and mandated in this case, in this additional setting, but also advice exactly how to wear them and how to ensure that they do the job that they potentially can do and don't set up any other unintended consequences.
Thank you, Professor Mickey. I wonder if I could turn to Dr. Hack. Dr. Hack, are you there? Yep.
Yes, thank you, Susan. I think you're absolutely right that what we need here is a strong public information and engagement campaign. The questions that Kitty raised are very, very important. We can't just say wear masks without explaining how to wear masks, how regularly, whether you should share, whether you should wash it, how tight should it be around your face? Is it better to have a cloth or a surgical one? There are so many questions out there, which even experts like us need more information on. And that should be front and public by the campaign and by the government, and that's not there. And the reason we need that public information campaign more than ever right now is because the government have said that they are going to enforce this through police fines. There's £100 fine if you don't have a mask. Now, we believe that that's absolutely wrong in the absence of a public information campaign that doesn't tell you not only why you should be wearing masks, but how you should be wearing masks. And the problem is we are still in the middle of a deadly pandemic. This is about safety. This is about keeping people alive. This should not be about penalizing people when they don't have all the information. So the most important thing is we have a strong public information campaign. And the most important thing is we don't have enforcement here, because we know already that Black and ethnic minority people in this country have been much more disproportionately affected by fines from the police.
Thank you, Dr. Hack. I am now going to turn to Vicki McKeever. Vicki from NBC. Are you with us, Vicki?
Hi, yeah. Thanks, Zach. So obviously I spoke to Susan earlier about this, and so apologies if I'm sort of going over old ground, but besides sort of the development of scientific evidence in favour of wearing masks, why has it taken so long for this kind of discussion and sort of thoughts of implementation about wearing masks in the UK? Because like data has shown, obviously, like historically there's been more of a habit of wearing masks, generally in Asia, but also like in the beginning of the pandemic, there was a study that came out that said like take up of wearing masks in sort of Italy and Spain was much higher than in the UK. So yeah, I just wondered why is the UK kind of been on sort of, why is it taking so long to come up over here?
Can I turn to Professor Scalia on this one? Why now?
Well, it's a good question to which really there isn't a satisfactory answer, except to look back at the whole timeline of the pandemic. And is there, another question you could ask, you turn around, is there an example of the UK government having been in advance of thinking and implementing things at the earliest possible opportunity when they thought they might be of benefit? The answer is no. And I think we have been bedeviled by an attitude which has been a voyeuristic attitude of sitting, watching what is happening, considering that, gathering data, considering the evidence, and then acting afterwards. Whereas in fact, public health is all about prevention, and it's being preemptive and getting in first and fast and hard. And if we had done all of the things we have done, but done them earlier, we would be in such a different position, and no one would have blamed you for going early anyway, because that's what public health measures are about. And I think the public understand that, and I don't think the government does. And it's been exactly the same with face coverings as with the rest of the interventions. I think that's all my personal view, of course.
Thank you, Professor Scally. I can see lots of hands once more. I'm going to go to Professor West next, please.
Yes, I think that one of the reasons why it becomes so important now is because we're in the process of, as they call it, easing the lockdown. If you look at the trajectory of infections and deaths in the UK, as Gabriel has said, the key issue was that we were late, probably a week or two at least, in bringing to effect the major social distancing measures that were the thing that was going to make the big difference. If we'd done that a week or two earlier, we would have had tens of thousands fewer deaths. It's unlikely, to be honest, that face masks would have made much of a difference in that trajectory, because if you look at the shape of that trajectory compared with other countries, it probably social distancing was the thing that really needed to happen. But it's now become obviously very relevant as we are easing that, and we're trying to minimize the number of infections or deaths in a situation in which we can't sustain that very extreme form of social distancing. So I think it's not, you put that together with the fact that, to be fair, as I explained earlier, the evidence wasn't strong, and whenever you put in place or legislate to put in place a measure that is going to force people to do something, historically in this country, we've been said, well, we've really got to be quite confident that it's going to have a benefit that outweighs the cost. So I'm not so worried about the fact that we're late on it, but the key thing here is that it's not about should we or should we not have face masks. It's about how to maximize the benefit and minimize the harms, and that's, I think, what the report is trying to focus on.
I'd like to go to Professor Riker and then Professor Scally before we move on, please.
Yes, people sometimes say there's something inherent about the British, which means that we are not going to wear face masks. It's something cultural. But when people use arguments like that, first of all, if you look at China, which is used as an example of a place where culturally they do wear face masks, well, they didn't until about 60 years ago, when they were deliberately introduced as actually as a sign of modernization, but also as a symbol of people caring for each other. So it wasn't something inherent about their culture. It was something which was deliberately introduced by clear leadership. Equally, when you look at Italy and Spain, and you mentioned Italy and Spain, early on in the pandemic, Italy and Spain had levels of face mask wearing, which were, if anything, lower than in the UK. And in 2 or 3 weeks, they went from around 20% to over 80%, and they still stand at 80%. And why? Because they were made compulsory. There was a very clear messaging, which is partly why we believe making them mandatory is absolutely critical. And the other point to be made about Italy is in Italy, there are not fines for not wearing face masks. You can be asked not to go on public transport or into shops if you're not wearing masks, but they are not adopting a fine approach. So mandation sends out an incredibly clear message that this is really important, and it doesn't need to be accompanied by enforcement or repression or fines, as we've said. So the simple answer to your question is the reason why people haven't been wearing face masks up to now is nothing to do with something inherent in being British. It's got everything to do with the lack of a clear leadership and clear guidance. Well, we've got that in terms of making it now mandatory. What we now need is equal clarity along the lines that people have spoken about so far, in terms of explaining people why they're necessary, why they're a sign, if nothing else, of good manners, of caring for your neighbor, and how to wear masks. So the mandation, good first step. Took a while to get there, but better late than never. But now they need to be properly explained, properly supported, and made available to everybody, irrespective of their financial means.
Thank you, Professor Riker. And Professor Scally?
Just one final point, and that is that I think one of our problems during the history of this pandemic in the UK is that there has been a search for the silver bullet, the one thing that's going to answer all our problems. And rather than looking at things as a cumulative advantage, a good example was the banning of mass gatherings, and the scientific view, or what the politicians said, the scientists were saying that there wasn't much of an advantage to cancelling mass gatherings, and there possibly wasn't. But every little advantage all adds up, and it's that cumulative action across all sorts of sectors and all sorts of activities that will enable us to keep the virus under control. So we absolutely shouldn't put all our eggs in any one basket, and face coverings are another basket we shouldn't put all our eggs in, but they have a valuable role, we think, in helping us to keep things under control.
Thank you, Professor Scalia. I'd like to invite Jonathan Fluxman. Jonathan, are you with us? There we have Jonathan, we got you.
Great. Thank you very much for having me today. And I'd just like to say a word of thanks to Independent Stage for the absolutely wonderful work you have done and continue to do. It's so very much appreciated. I'm a retired GP. I live in West London, in fact, in the borough of Brent, and I'm sure you know Brent is probably the worst affected borough in the country. So I have a very active interest in COVID, and I've been doing quite a lot of reading. My question is around the issue of aerosol spread of COVID-19 and the very welcome change by WHO that is now recognized this as a route of transmission. And what I wanted to ask the panel was whether it's now time for us here in England and Public Health England in particular, and other official guidance like the return to work guidance, to formally acknowledge aerosol spread and everything that flows from it, such as the requirement for proper ventilation, excuse me, in all enclosed spaces, particularly in the workplace. Professor Mickey, you've mentioned the outbreaks in the meatpacking plants. I mean, in the garment industry in Leicester, we've seen this. And it seems pretty clear that aerosol spread has certainly been a part of the reason why we've had these super spreader events. So to my mind, I think it's really important that we move very quickly to changing and updating official guidance, because we all depend on that, both as individuals, organizations, employers, and so on. You know, what's the official guidance, and we'll follow that in our day-to-day lives. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the question, Jonathan. I wonder, Professor Scalia, can I turn back to you on this one first?
Well, it's an excellent question, a good point, and the science of this has been developing over the period of time. It's largely laboratory-based science and some excellent assessments of what happens, and the addition of the problem of aerosol is very timely. But we've known for some time that ventilation makes a big difference, in particular in the huge difference that it makes being outdoors and indoors. And in some of our earlier reports, particularly about schools, getting schools back, we were very clear that we thought that better ventilation in schools and having as much of the school activity outdoors was a very wise, would be a wise way to move. Now, that hasn't happened yet, but I hope those sort of issues will be considered, and we should be looking at the ventilation of all places in terms of helping us out by increasing airflow. And it's a very old public health message, of course, isn't it? Because that's improved ventilation of buildings was one of the reasons that we were able to reduce the very high prevalence of tuberculosis when it was at its worst. And we just need to relearn those messages about ventilation of buildings and domestic dwellings. And we should be, I think, in the aftermath of this pandemic, be looking at our building regulations as well. As far as I remember, we're now in the UK building some of the smallest domestic spaces in Western Europe for people to live in. And we should be looking again at the building regulations to see what they have to say about ventilation, making sure we have ventilation levels at a satisfactory level for the future.
Let me go to Professor Mickey and then to Dr. Hack.
A really important point. And again, there hasn't been a public information campaign on this. People should be encouraged to have their windows open at home as much as possible. Also on buses, every time I go onto a bus, I immediately open the windows. They're usually shut. I presume it's because people don't know that it's a good idea to have them open. And definitely in terms of return to work guidance. But many workplaces don't have access to openable windows. And they have different kinds of air conditioning. And some of the air conditioning is helpful because it's drawing in air from outside. Some of it's extremely unhelpful. And this is an area where there has to be expertise, and there needs to be risk and impact assessments done in all workplaces before people come back into workplaces. But yeah, again, in terms of the face coverings, people do need to realise that they're not going to do it in the main for these aerosols, and these are looking like an important transmission route.
Thank you, Professor Mickey. Dr. Hack?
Well, I was going to say, guidance tends to follow public government messaging, not government messaging. And so at the moment, the reason the guidance is behind is because the government messaging, I keep saying public, sorry, the government messaging is confused and behind. And we've got at the moment a government who have been focusing on financial incentives to ask us to return to the economy and to help the economy, instead of focusing on the message that the only way we can go back to work and the only way the economy can open back up is by suppressing the virus, by zero COVID. Now, if you had that strong, clear messaging that that's the only way it can happen, then public guidance and public health guidance, would follow suit. But the reason it's not following at the moment is because that messaging is very clear. So we need a government to once again be very, very clear about its strategy, say that it's focusing on zero COVID, and actually focus on eliminating this virus, rather than, for instance, setting up financial incentives for us to bring the economy back up to scratch.
Thank you, Dr. Hack. And thanks once again for the question. I would like to now pass to Ian Sample from The Guardian. Ian, are you there?
I am here. Yeah, I am here. I'm just clicking the relevant bits and bobs on the computer. Thanks everyone for this. I want to come back to some of the points we've talked about already. Just to clarify, does Independent Sage think we should drop the idea of fines in England for not wearing masks? And on this idea of making masks free to people who cannot afford them, I wondered if someone might expand on how we should do that. I don't know if there are any countries that are doing this well. And importantly, what do we risk if we don't do that? Thanks.
I wonder if I might come to Professor Riker, and then maybe Dr. Hack wants to come in on this one as well.
Yes, I don't think fines are necessary. I mean, I don't speak for everyone. And as Susan said at the beginning, one of the things we want to do is to, in a sense, elaborate this paper by getting input from others. What I think we all agree on is that the primary approach should not be repressive, and the first instinct should not be to punish. It should be, and actually this is in line with the guidance from the College of Policing and its 4 E's approach. You should start by engaging, by explaining and encouraging. And if you have any sanctions, if you have enforcement, they should only come long after. One of the things about making things mandatory is it allows you to engage. It allows you to ask, but it needs to be done carefully. Because the other point we want to make really strongly is we do not want to make certain groups who cannot wear masks feel attacked. And we think it's not only important in terms of authorities, but in terms of other people. You don't start off by being punitive. You don't start off by attacking people. You start off by trying to understand and seeing how you can't help. And if people can't wear masks, then they can't wear masks, and you accept that. We're not going to get to 100% compliance, but if we get to where Italy and Spain are, which is in the mid-80s, that will make a huge difference. So yes, we don't go for a punitive approach. Exactly what that means, exactly how we achieve that, I think is a matter of debate. But as a matter of general approach, I think we have a consensus around that. And the point about making masks available, again, I think we are all agreed on the principle. There are different ways of doing it. One very simple way would be to send a packet of masks to every household, along with the information that is necessary, and it would be part of the public information campaign. After all, we're doing letter drops to every household on a reasonably regular basis. It wouldn't be too difficult to do this. Another model is to make masks available where they are necessary. So, for instance, early on in a number of European countries, Spain, I understand, they gave out masks on public transport, and we could go down that line as well. So as Susan said at the beginning, and as I said just now, I think the principles we're quite clear on. Don't be punitive, be supportive, and be fully understanding of how people can't make masks, who can't wear masks. And secondly, make sure that there is not a restriction on people's ability to wear masks for financial reasons. And the best ways of doing that is something we want to debate today. And we very much welcome people chipping in, or indeed emailing us, because we're going to be just having a discussion amongst ourselves after this meeting and getting feedback and trying to use the insights of the public. And let me just finish with this point. One of the things that we have said throughout as a principle of getting good policy is co-production. You don't impose it on people. You don't tell people what to do. You listen to people and you use their knowledge and you use their insights into the problems and you build that in. And I think it's very important that we practice what we preach and that we practice co-production. And this meeting is one way in which we welcome and we solicit input to improve our ideas. We don't have every answer, and the public has got a huge font of good sense, and we want to draw upon it.
Professor Riker. Dr. Hack.
Very quickly, I won't take long. I think I absolutely echo what Professor Riker said. This should be seen as face masks should be seen as a measure to keep people safe. I mean, we have to keep remembering this. This is all about keeping people safe. This measure shouldn't be perceived as penalizing people. This doesn't require a criminal justice response. This requires a strong public information campaign and a strong engagement campaign, which includes, by the way, understanding why some people won't wear the mask. People might have very good reasons. They won't have certificates to prove why they can't wear masks. There'll be all sorts of reasons, and that's fundamentally important. But of course, as I mentioned before, it's also about the fact that for instance, from Runnymede perspective, I'm the director of Runnymede Trust, a race equality think tank. From our perspective, we have seen that enforcement during COVID-19 has had a very detrimental impact on Black and ethnic minority communities. They've been almost twice as likely to be fined under COVID-19, especially in London. So that's a huge concern. So completely echo what Professor Riker said, that this needs to be backed up by public information and campaign. Oh, and sorry, just to answer your second question, Ian, yes, it needs to be made free. And Professor Riker's suggestion that we send it to every household along with leaflets means that people not only get a better understanding of how and why it needs to be used, and the how is very, very important, but they also get a sample of what is a good mask.
Thank you, Dr. Hack. I'm conscious of time and we want to get through as many questions as we can. We might have time for one or two more. I'm going to pass to, is Karen Bales with us? Karen, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Brilliant.
Okay, National Education Union executive member. The official SAGE documents describe schools as high contact workplaces and recommends in schools where social distancing can't be maintained, other mitigations should be in place, including wearing masks. However, unlike in other countries, the DfE guidance written without union consultation, except social distancing isn't possible in schools, also states that although students must wear masks on transport to and from school, masks shouldn't be worn in schools, which are also poorly ventilated. So my question is, in light of the recent increase of outbreaks in schools, would mask wearing in schools reduce the risk to our members and students, particularly those in or living with those in vulnerable groups, who are all expected back full-time in September?
I'm sure I'm going to see lots of hands on this one. Let me go to Professor Mickey first.
This is a really complex issue, and I think it's an issue where it really requires a discussion with all the relevant parties, with parents, with students themselves, with trade unions, with governing bodies, with local authorities, to think about in any of the different situations they're going to be in the school day, what the pros and cons are for different groups of school students to be wearing masks. I've been contacted by several parents on the subject, and one of them actually was recommending the practice for older school students, and also suggesting that there could be different coloured masks for different year groups or different bubble groups, so that it could be much easier to find out who should be with whom. So I thought that was quite an interesting idea to think about how to manage the whole school process. But I think what's really important, going back to the previous points about what's needed to happen, is people need to have the tools to do good risk assessment and risk management. And the bottom line is that every situation that has different people within it is going to be a risk. The more people there are, the longer time you're in contact with them, and the closer in distance you are, the higher the risk. So for some people within the school setting, face masks may indeed be an option. But I would say take the broad principles we've been talking about today, and then all the relevant people, the groups that I've just mentioned, who have the on-the-ground understanding, get together to think about what's going to be most practical. Now, it may differ school to school. You know, you may have a school where it's easy to open all the windows and people can, the students can be quite far apart. That's a very different situation than one with small windows, difficult to open, where there is going to be crowding. So I would say it's not a single solution for all schools.
So David, can I come to you on this one? I see a hand. You're on mute.
I'm going to give you an answer, Karen, that you're not quite expecting, and that is, I don't believe the school should be opened until we've approached zero COVID. So this is a big challenge, because we want the schools to be open in September. And it means over to the government, please lock us down, manage the disease, bring it right down to a level of roughly 1 in a million people, and we will manage to open schools much more safely. In other words, wait until the level of disease in the population at large has been brought down much more than where we are today.
Thank you, Sir David. And Karen, I'm sure you've seen, but there is an independent SAGE report on schools that perhaps you could also refer to. Dr. Hack, did you have something you wanted to add here?
No, I'm conscious of time, so thank you.
Okie doke. I'm going to we've got time for just a couple more questions. Can we go to Francesca Oliver? Francesca, are you there?
Hello, can you hear me?
We can.
So I'm from the charity Action on Hearing Loss. So we're the largest UK charity supporting people with hearing loss and deafness. So it was touched on earlier that face coverings and masks are making communication difficult for this group of people, for everyone as well. But those who are deaf or have hearing loss are finding it are being disproportionately affected, as they are reliant on visual cues to communicate. So not only lip reading, but also those who use sign language, use kind of facial expression and lip patterns to kind of understand what people are saying. There's also other groups of people that are disproportionately affected by the use of, or by covering our faces. So while we absolutely appreciate the need to follow public health advice and keep people safe, have the kind of unintended consequences of widespread use of face coverings for these groups been taken into consideration enough, do you think? Or do you think there are other measures that could be put in place, such as, I know you touched on public awareness. We absolutely agree that there should be raised public awareness of these people, of these groups of people and the difficulties that they have.
Let me go to Dr. Hack first on this one.
Now, Francesca, we've actually been going back and forth with this question. It's a really difficult one because you raised the most important aspect of it, which is, have the government carried out any kind of impact assessment on what rolling out this measure means? Which groups will it affect? Which workplaces will it affect? Where does it need to be extended? All those questions are really fundamentally important, but the equality impact assessment is one that we haven't seen anything on. And the most important thing about carrying out an equality impact assessment is, once you identify which groups are disadvantaged by your measure, you can then think about, how can I bring about another policy, or how can I take other measures to mitigate the impact of this one that I'm rolling out? And there's been none of that. So we would love to answer your question directly about how do you circumnavigate that. But to be quite honest, this is one that the government should have been addressing and should still be addressing while they're rolling out this measure. They should have done it beforehand, but I think we still need to push them on this.
Professor Scalia, can I come to you?
Yeah, it's a great question, Francesca. And I think one of the things that we've noted in our work is how poor the communication with the public in general is about all of the issues that we're all facing. And for public health, that's the clue's in the title, isn't it? It's about the public, and the public need to understand it, and they need to be part of the change and part of making it work. And that will mean explaining to the general public that there are people for whom face coverings of all sorts cause problems, and how those problems can be mitigated, and how they can interact respectfully and easily with people who have hearing difficulties. And we need to be giving them that information. People shouldn't have to, as I have done, go to your excellent website to find your tips on how to communicate in an era of wearing face masks. The government should be doing that for us all, shouldn't they? And so I think this is predominantly an educational and an information giving issue. Thank you.
Perhaps I can come to Professor Riker.
Yeah, I mean, as everyone's been saying, this is an extremely difficult one, because it's not about people with hearing difficulties not wearing masks. It's about other people not wearing masks, and therefore it impacts upon everyone. So there is no simple solution. But I want to come back to what I was saying earlier about the purpose of this meeting being in part for us to provide information, but also for us to listen. So in many ways, I would be particularly interested to hear from you what you think needs to be done, because it's perfectly clear that not enough has been done. It's perfectly clear that the government to date hasn't been clear enough. And one of the things that Independent Sage has been trying to do is to fill those gaps, to give constructive advice and to help the government move forward. So if you can help us and we can help you, that would be extremely valuable. If you want to do it now, I would find that really valuable. If you wanted to email us and point anything out which is additional to what's on the website, that would be immensely valuable to us as well.
Thank you, Professor Riker. And as ever, I'm afraid that's going to have to bring us to an end. Time has flown by. It just leaves me to thank everybody who's joined us with your questions. These sessions really are invaluable for the whole panel. I know they appreciate your time. And thanks to those who've joined us once again across our platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and live on YouTube. So thanks once again, and we shall see you again soon. Thank you.